Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning and welcome back to my lecture for the course Partition of India in Print Media and Cinema. It is a continuation, the discussion on womanhood and motherhood. So, we would like to start today's lecture with a reference to Jawaharlal Nehru's quotation in the Discovery of India, his famous work, where he states, "Our ladies stepped up to the plate and took command of the battle. Of course, women had always existed, but suddenly there was an avalanche of them, which surprised not only the British authorities, but also their own men. Here were these ladies, higher or middle class women, living in their own homes, peasant women, working class women, wealthy women, pouring out in their tens of thousands in defiance of the official order. It was not only their bravery and boldness, what was much more unexpected was the organizational power they demonstrated." Unquote. So, here we see a glorious picture, a celebratory picture of women, where Nehru is actually lionizing their struggle and their noteworthy contribution to the anti-colonial movements. So, we have already referred to M.K. Gandhi's non-violent civil disobedience campaign, which was known as the Satyagraha movement, where women had actively participated. So, majority of the recorded history of India's partition, however, does not account for the common men, women and children's suffering, and how these events left a long lasting mark on those who survived different forms of loss. So, generally, as is typical of wars, partition had a distinct impact on women more than on men, owing to the unique responsibilities associated with each gender. So, women were not in charge of their own fate during the partition riots and the aftermath. So, whether they would suicide, survive or migrate was something that their male kin had to decide for them. So, they were subjected to violence at the level of community, at the level of family and at macro levels. So, women are seen as emblems of honor on for each community, such that dishonor on the body of the woman is understood as betrayal of the community's faith, the community's culture and everything that is considered as sacred by the people. So, during the partition and even in the riots that follow till the modern day, till the turn of the century, in each and every riot, what is remarkable is that the patterns of violence are very similar. So, we see that the violence is wrought, inflicted on two places, generally two sites that are attacked. One is the religious shrine of the enemy community and then the body of the enemy community's female kin are violated. Once a woman is impregnated by a man from another community or race, she is considered as impure and the child born under such circumstances is tainted in terms of the community's sense of purity. So, the child is considered as impure in terms of the community's sense of purity. Now, women were actually not decision makers, like Urvashi Butalia in her book The Other Side of Silence discusses how people generally like to keep silent about the missing women in their families. She talks about one such family where majority of the members had been killed during the partition and the riots that followed. So, she says, I quote, they had made no direct mention of their sisters, two of them who had vanished at the time. Everyone in their immediate vicinity is familiar with the story. I realized there was numerous separate histories hidden in the stillness, the accounts that have always lurked on the outside of the ones that have been recounted, unquote. So, there are histories within history. There are so many blind spots that actually need to be bypassed for a formal history to be able to shape itself in a neat manner, in a polished fashion. So, the Indias within India, the histories within history can be discovered through referring to these alternative voices, alternative memories. So, there were rampant abductions, murdering and rapes, and the family patriarchs actually would safeguard the family honor through compelling women to commit suicide. Women would be goaded to commit suicide through jumping off into wells, through touching the electric wire, and or through consuming poison. So, once a woman was violated, she was molested, she would hardly be taken back by the family, and the children born of rape were denied any fundamental rights because they were seen as unlawful and sinful. So, Nayanika Mukherjee studies the war and the sentiment of sorrow that is built differently around the male and the female war victims. So, the pain of the father or the brother of a raped woman and the pain of a martyr are shaped very differently, they are understood very differently. So, the former is, as she says, emphasized as part of the nationalist commemoration of the war. So, the female loss is localized in relational terms on the other hand, the sorrowful widow, the sorrowful mother and the sorrowful sister. So, we understand that the losses, the sense of losses for both genders are very different. War and civil disruptions cultivate the expressive imagery of patriotic motherhood and an ever ready womb that is constantly giving birth to strong sons and supporting husbands, sending the sons and one's husband to combat zones. So, this is one question that is studied by several feminist critics of partition scholarship. They look at how women have an inspirational role. Women's loss is understood only in terms of the loss of the body. So, men can afford to lose property, men can afford to lose or win the nation, they can afford to win a power position in terms of territorial domination, establishing control over a territory, but women's territory is essentially their own body. So, Urvashi Butalia, Ritu Menon, Kamla Bhasin, all of these feminist critics of partition studies look at the gendered form of violence that took place during partition, where women were the synecdoche of honor for their own community and conversely a territory of annexation for their enemy. So, they became receptacle of morbid radicalism, and these can be understood through extremely heinous and base acts such as tattooing or amputating of women's private parts. Sometimes they would be stripped and made to parade on public places, they would be unclothed and made to perform in holy shrines. So, penetration and disfiguring of her body was understood as this violation, this humiliation was considered as being transferred to the entire community, right. And to add to this affliction, own family members would play the quasi murderer's role, goading them to kill themselves. Urvashi Butalia states in Gender and Nation, so I would quote her. She says that when women narrate the nation, they do so rather differently than men. In men's narratives of the nation, women are often seen as symbols of national and family honor. In women's narratives, the concerns are often different. The need to keep the family together, to contain grief, to put closures on unexplained deaths, to try and somehow contain the violence that such a situation inevitably unleashes, unquote. So, we have several authors that have produced momentous artworks on the woman and partition, centering the woman in the context of partition. So, Rajinder Singh Bedi, Rahi Masum Raza, Ismat Chugtai, Sadat Hasan Manto, Yashpal, Visham Sahani, Amrit Pritam are some of these names that document the experience of female riot victims and their trauma. And then we have notable scholars such as Urvashi Butalia, Ashish Nandi, Veena Das, Ritu Menon, Kamla Bhasin and Gyanendra Pandey. So, we talk about, when we talk of women, we also talk about home. I would like to hark back what Sara Suleri observes. She says, men live in homes and women live in bodies. So, in an Indian society, a woman is not usually associated with rights to acquire assets and property such as home or land. So, a woman's tragedy is always hinged around her body. A man's tragedy or loss could be hinged around loss of land, loss of a homestead. She can only afford to lose her body and own it. So, we see majority of these women who were forced to flee their homes did so with the expectation that once the riots had stopped, once the turmoils had calmed down, they would come back. I was already talking about this character in Jade by Ismat Chugtai, and then Joginder Paul's Urdu story Daro Gaon Pyas, where he depicts the character of Baby. These matriarchs, old matriarchs are adamant and they carry the keys of the Haveli, and with the key becomes synecdoche of the Haveli that they are carrying in their mind, and they are carrying the key on their person all the time, imagining that they would come back someday. So, according to Sabagul Khattak, who writes about the experiences of Afghan women, the Afghan female migrants, Khattak would say that the Afghan refugee women actually conflate, they merge the notion of home with the notion of watan, right. Coming back to home, homecoming is like returning to one's watan. For a woman, there is no larger meaning of watan, especially for a woman that has lived all her life in parda. Watan and home are synonymous. Home thus denotes, with home there is a concept of belonging to a place, to a community, and so it is a way of life and a form of existence as well as a culture of thought. So, having to lose one's home actually verges on the question of identity crisis. So, the trauma of the partition drove women out of their houses, and there were these different state devised policies to bring them back through rescue operations, right. And the feminist critics actually question the nature of these policies, how far they were fair, how far were they doing any justice to the women concerned, the female victims. So, we see that Rameshwari Nehru had visited Thua Khalsa, the mythological village, and the genealogy of Thua Khalsa, that is actually mentioned in reference to the Sikh women's bravery and martyrdom. So, a group of Sikh women had almost 80 or 90 women had jumped off into a well. So, the Muslims do not attack and convert them, and they had read their holy book, and they were actually encouraged to perform this act. This was seen, the suicide at that point in that circumstance was seen as a sacrosanct act. And it is actually remembered, it is once again a kind of archetypal memory. These sorts of memories are valued for their archetypal qualities, celebrated as monuments and statues. So, they are erected at the heart of nationalist sentiments. So, they are monumentalized basically. So, we see that Rameshwari Nehru, in the capacity of a social worker that is associated with Indian National Congress, visits Thua Khalsa, where the women had suicided in a well, jumping into a well, and she glorifies these pure women, and this is immediately connected with the historical performance of Johar by Queen Padmini to escape Alauddin Khilji's attacks. So, Thua Khalsa brings back the collective Punjabi memory, the pride of it becomes synonymous with the pride of a community and a race, and Thua Khalsa becomes the idyllic village site reflecting order and cleanliness. So, Damayanti Sehgal discusses the challenges that were experienced, that she experienced in rescuing women, many of whom had been rejected by their families, and some of whom had refused to go back because and they were already married to the abductors at the time they were being recovered. So, and some of them had given birth to children. They very well knew, they were very well aware that their families would never take them back. So, they were reluctant to, and for some it was a forced uprooting from one reality and grafting them back to their former state of existence where they would not be accepted. So, it was a kind of uprooting them from their current reality that they had come to accept and bringing them back to their former state of existence where hardly they would be accepted. So, we see of many of these stories, such as the case of the character of Lajo in Rajinder Singh Bedi's short story Lajwanti, where she is not publicly punished, she is taken back by her husband Sundarlal. However, Sundarlal cannot come to accept the defiled wife that Lajo has become now. So, he treats her with a lot of honor and thereby as the untouchable Devi. He puts her in the pedestal of the goddess, and so there is, the relation has become fake and hypocritical. It's not only glorifying the woman, but actually punishing her through pushing her away from a normal and a spontaneous existence. So, denying her a normal and spontaneous existence. So, we see this notion of honor, chastity, purity deeply internalized at the heart of the masculinist society, right. Similarly, women that joined the workforce, we have a short story by Mohan Rakesh, it is called Miss Pal. Miss Pal is locating herself heroically in a society that is dominated by the males. She is a product of a generation of female refugees that had moved out of the precincts of home. So, we have another story by Lalitambika Antarjanam, it is called A Leaf in the Storm. It's the story of a woman that has been violated multiply, and she has actually given birth. The entire story of Jyoti is about it's about her emotional and reflective responses and monologues to the baby, the unborn child in her womb that she has conceived as a result of a gang rape. So, she has both these feelings. On the one hand, the child arouses maternal feelings within her and she wants to lay claim on the child. The child gives her a chance to live afresh, and yet the biological reality of this pregnancy reminds her of it enables the memory of the rapists. So, if we look at some of the important dates, December 6, 1947, after independence, the governments of India and Pakistan passed a formal abducted persons bill and agreed to set up cooperative recovery operations. December 15, 1949, the Constituent Assembly of India declared that 12,000 women had been recovered in India and 6,000 in Pakistan. Even in the 1990s, there were reports of women still living in the refugee camps who were either unclaimed by their families, or in some cases they refused to find or found it impossible to go back to their home. So, decisions that were imposed by the state policies on the women raised questions about their own agency and the question of the women's choice. So, when we talk about recovering women's versions, women's own stories, we should also be careful, like Anne Hargrove says, we should be careful of not crossing a threshold that actually violates the woman's sense of privacy for the sake of scholarship. So, even the most critical and sensitive scholarship are guilty of appropriating her resisting voice, the woman's resisting voice, and using it as a symbol of identity for the purpose of research, right. So, there is no question of neutral space for a survivor, for a rape survivor to return to. So, for many such women, the abductor's family had become their home. They had to accept, they were incorporated in the abductor's family and given the status of respected wives and mothers. So, and it is very difficult for the survivors to speak, and how far, like Annie Hargrove asks, how far can we push them to tell about their accounts? In many cases, telling about one's past experience would reveal a male relation. It could be one's husband, one's brother-in-law, or the neighbor as a former rapist. So, or maybe the woman has been raped by someone else and then repatriated to her present family. So, all these topics generally have a lot of taboo and discomfort around them. And Veena Das Veena Das's theory on changed meanings of reproduction and childbearing during the politicization of identity groups, actually it discusses how women were impregnated by the other men, the men outside of the community, and their imperil after giving birth to the wrong child. So, Abducted Persons Bill did not recognize marriages that had happened as a result of abduction. Children that were born of such coercive unions, forceful unions, were considered as illegitimate. So, what happens to a child born of rape? Motherhood to such a child would mark the woman herself as an outsider. So, she actually occupied a liminal position where she was neither here nor there, she was not part of any community. Like the critics say, she had no neutral place to go back to. And the state was playing and indirectly playing a paternalistic role in forcing the woman to terminate such pregnancies. One of the feminist studies points how women would be brought to Jalandhar and they would be cleansed. So, in the name of cleansing, basically they were being forced to abort the unwanted pregnancy. And so, we see the quiet yet forceful coercive ways devised by the state policy in retaining integrity during the traumatic situations. According to Ramchandra Behra's study, the Abducted Persons Act states that the women who have children born in Pakistan must leave them behind. Similarly, children born in India must remain in India. So, the child's identity is being formed in continuation, or the child's identity is connected to the father, whether Hindu or Muslim. The woman has to cross the border and come back to her natal home, leaving the child behind. So, that was another, that was another bill that is imbued with patriarchal values. So, the figure of the abducted woman is necessarily a symbol of crossing borders, violating or transgressing the socio-political cultural boundaries. So, we also see that the woman, the meaning of communal violence for a woman changes depending on her age, gender and lack of self agency or self charge. So, at the border women would be exchanged like cattle and there would be counting, they would be simply numbers. The values of women would be less if they were older. A young woman that is capable of giving birth would be considered as more valuable as a repatriated object or commodity. So, women were essentially being commoditized at the time in the decades that followed partition. Their sexual value, their values were being considered in terms of their capacity of giving birth and contributing to the nation. So, in India we have already talked about how the upper caste Hindus have always fixated around the image of the mother and the wife, and they are seen as they play a key role in safeguarding the values of the community. So, in the same way, Sherry Feldman would study that the growth of Islamization in Pakistan would lead to privatization of roles in public arena. Meaning, what we are trying to understand here is that the state policies actually, or the decisions, the policies made by a particular government, a particular regime have a lot to do with the government's perception or take on women, how they look at women's emancipation, the question of women's identities. So, if a government is orthodox, it would formulate its policies in terms of curbing the freedom of the women. In Pakistan, we would see that religion plays a paramount role in defining women's identities. So, a government shapes its image as a modern, its policies in very gendered terms, and a government's, a nation's appearance, a nation's self-imaging as a modern state is also incumbent on the identity of the woman. For example, General Ziaur Rahman's government would encourage women's visibility and their participation in the NGOs. However, General Ershad actually brought in religious values to weigh on governmental policies, such that women's public visibility was considered in Bangladesh. Women's public visibility was considered as immodest and something that leads to something that leads to surrendering to modernization. So, in immediate post-partition decades, we see that women exercised usual freedom in determining their marital partners when the national boundaries were in flux. However, with the hardening of the borders and formation of India and Pakistan, the state takes on the role of the protector, the benevolent protector and provider, where the state gets to decide the woman and the child's, where the state determines where the woman and the child belongs. So, formation of Pakistan was seen as loss of India's territory, and so with great urgency what needed to be recovered was India's movable property, the women. And so, the recovery operations actually informed the subsequent shaping of policies and the process of rehabilitation. It would serve to remember that while the nation in the South Asian context is worshipped as the mother, the state or the governmental system is the father. It can be either benevolent or authoritarian depending on the position it wants to assume. So, the government offers protection to women and children. The symbol of nation takes after the image of the woman. However, the nation is run through patriarchal logic and values that are deeply rooted in patriarchy. So, the government, which is generally a masculine concept, offers protection to women and to children, which has an inbuilt assumption that women and children cannot protect themselves, they are vulnerable, and in exchange for this protection the government seeks to control women's sexuality. With this, I would like to conclude today's lecture. Thank you.